Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Ancient East Asia uh, review video. And to begin with, we're going to start talking about one of our civilizations, the Indus River civilization, otherwise known as the Harappan civilization, from one of its key cities. Yeah, in a lot of ways, the Harappan society, as you brought up, or the Indus River Valley Society, is sort of unique in a lot of ways. I mean, it seems like a lot of these river valley civilizations that we're talking about have quite a few aspects in common. I thought you did a really good comparison last week between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and you see China this week as well. But it seems the Indus River Valley is sort of an outlier in a number of ways, which you brought up. First of all, though, you did a very good job talking about some of the similarities between the Indus River Valley and the other river valley civs that we've been talking about. The fact that they did live in cities, that they were dependent upon water, that they were surviving off of agriculture. Um, Taking a look at sort of their relationship with their natural environments, how it sort of seemed like it wasn't quite as stable as, for example, the Nile River, but the Indus River was still sort of more predictable and less catastrophic than the Tigris or Euphrates rivers. So sort of a middle ground, so to speak, in the case of the Indus River Valley. But in a lot of ways, the Indus River Valley civilization was very unique, right? That, for example, the Indus River Valley civilization, as far as we know, didn't have any form of kingship. That there was no indication that there was one individual who was leading these cities, these very large cities that they were created. Obviously, there was some sort of detailed level of organization going on in these cities. As you know, you talked about like all the bricks being a standard size, how they're being laid out on a grid system, how there's obviously very advanced city planning to get running water and these public baths and things like that. That you really do need a high level of organization and structure within these cities. But we really don't know what that would have looked like because most of the evidence that we see correlating to that in these other large civilizations is really missing here from the Indus Valley civilization. Um, Another thing that people pointed out that it seemed like there was a lot of competition and warfare in the other civilizations we've talked about so far. And once more, there's really no evidence for that in the Indus River Valley society. The cities did have walls, but it seemed like they were more just to kind of keep wild animals out than for people. They really weren't defensive structures. There's no evidence of them having weapons of any kind. Even the kind of few examples that archaeologists at one point in time or another had thought were examples of conflict and warfare usually seem to have just been accidents or something like that. So it seemed like this is, as far as we know, was a relatively very kind of peaceful civilization with a number of very large cities that had these cultural elements in common, but it seems like there wasn't a lot of direct, military competition between any of these locations. Another thing that a lot of you compared and said that the Indus River Valley civilization had in common with other civilizations was its trade, right? That it was reaching out and trading with its neighbors. Of course, it's possible that it traded with plenty of locations in the surrounding area up into Central Asia and even to Mesopotamia. There's evidence that there's trade between Mesopotamia and the Indus River Valley. So pretty interesting that is certainly one combination too. That even though the Indus River Valley seemed to lack a lot of these other dynamics, that it still maintained trade and contact and behaved in that way like a lot of these other river valley civilizations that we have seen. Just on the basic level too, just the fact that we don't know as much about the Indus River Valley civilization, it probably paints the way that it's different than the other civilizations. For example, in Egypt and in China and to a certain degree Mesopotamia, there's still populations living in those areas that are, kind of directly culturally descended from the groups that had been living there. Certainly in China, even though, of course, they had gone through several iterations. Whereas that's not really the case here in the Indus River Valley. Of course, they have some sort of script, but we it hasn't been translated. We don't know what it says. So that sort of written information that we can take from Mesopotamia or Egypt or China, we don't have the written element here, which also makes us kind of overly reliant upon archaeology. So that certainly is another kind of key difference, is the level of information. But yeah, I mean it's very interesting to think of how different the civilization is, and to a certain degree, some of those differences might be on account of us not having those written records and testimonials. But the archaeological evidence is pretty clear cut that there's some major differences between the Indus River Valley and the others that we've seen, as far as the leadership, the detailed planning, the running water, which is awesome. I know if I lived in the ancient world, that'd be a big draw for me. And also kind of the artistic styles, which we talked a little bit about in the document activity for this week. But overall, I thought the class did a very good job comparing and contrasting the Indus River to the other civilizations we've discussed so far. All right, looking at China now, talking about the pros and cons of the mandate of heaven. What are some of its advantages did it give China, and what were some of the risks to the philosophy? Um, so, as in way of description, what's more, I thought everyone did a good job of this. Pretty much the idea was the dynastic cycle of China was supposed to be cyclical in nature, that a new group or new emperor would take over, start a new dynasty, kind of renew hope, bring in good laws and good rules and good government. But as time would go on, not all rulers can be great, right? I mean, we know that about any kind of model of kingship. That's always one of its greatest weaknesses. That a lot of times, how the strength of an empire or a kingdom is directly correlated to the leadership ability of one particular monarch. And if you go through a stretch where there's two or three or more poor rulers, it can really impact and damage an empire or a ruling system. And it seems like the mandate of heaven kind of corrects for that, because when that poor rulership kind of comes into play, combined with kind of people start looking for kind of other natural elements to back up this idea that things aren't going well. For example, floods and famines, invasions, all occurring. You can see down here number 3, and it then is perceived that the ruler has lost the approval of the gods. And as long as things are going good, the people are supposed to give this kind of unwavering loyalty to the emperor and the ruling structure. But once that concept of the mandate of heaven is lost, it then becomes permissible to start resisting that government or the empire, start fighting back against it, and eventually overthrowing the dynasty. And importantly here, whatever new dynasty rises up to take over and take the mantle is considered more or less legitimate by the majority of the people. That the old kingdom had lost the mandate, new kingdom gains the mandate, and then we start back over with number 1, how the new kingdom or the new dynasty is supposed to come in with improved laws, improved government, and that people are supposed to then properly kind of fall in line and support the new governing system. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think this gives a lot of advantages and potential disadvantages to China. First of all, China was able to maintain itself in a very kind of stable manner, despite a lot of the same fluctuations and pressures and disruptances that you see occurring in other ancient locations. But every time, China seems like they're able to reform themselves along very similar patterns and reemerge. And I think a large part of it is the idea of the mandate of heaven, that the sort of ruling ideology that people, once there is a change, are willing to back and support a new ruler or a new dynasty, and kind of very quickly get back to business, so to speak, ultimately becomes very important. And this is certainly one of the biggest advantages that it gives China, that even if there is a disruption, even to the degree of an outside foreign group coming in and conquering China, what oftentimes happen is that this process continues to go. Whoever the conquerors are, a lot of times kind of become enculturated into Chinese culture. It's perceived that they now have the mandate of heaven, and China just sort of continues on in a manner that would be much more disruptive in a lot of the other locations that we are going to be talking about throughout the class period here. Also, because there's this idea of kind of a standard that the emperors and their governments are supposed to be adhering to and upholding, it's very much encouraging them to behave in that way, right? That they're supposed to be doing a good job. They're supposed to be filling their roles. They're not supposed to be overtaxing the population. They're not supposed to be forcing them into conscripted labor, or things of that nature that would cause them to lose the mandate. So it's sort of a check, like a check and balance, a check being placed on the leadership of China, that even though they're supposed to have this kind of divine power, they can't just do whatever they want with it. They still have to operate and try to provide a good government for the empire or the country, and that if they lose that, it's then permissible for the people to try to seek a change. So a pretty interesting thing, that an advantage that it gives the Chinese, that a lot of other civilizations never quite get to that point. But of course, this philosophy does not come without its risks as well, which a lot of people did a really good job pointing out. For example, if things like natural disasters, floods, and famines, and outside invasions are supposed to be signs of an emperor or a king losing the mandate, a lot of those are things that could just be completely outside of the ruler's control, and they might be a really good ruler, but all sort of these kind of random, unfortunate things start happening that make people start questioning his leadership. Ultimately, that's really not the way it plays out. It seems what happens more typically is, once the power of a dynasty begins to weaken, once it seems like the governments are not fulfilling their proper functions, then people start looking at these sort of natural phenomena as sort of a justification of what they already think. If people are generally happy with the emperor and a flood happens, they're much more likely to sort of turn a blind eye, and a lot of times it might be because the emperor was able to get effective flood relief, for example, to help support the country in that situation. Whereas if there's already sort of grumblings from about the government, there's already sort of a questioning of the legitimacy. Once these natural phenomena start happening, then they're sort of used as a justification or a sign that yes, now the approval is starting to shift. So it's not like, if an emperor is in place, a flood happens, they're immediately kicked out. It wasn't quite that strict, but it was more of a way for people to show and to provide evidence for the fact that perhaps the mandate of heaven was being lost. But overall, very very good answers to this question, and really kind of diving in deep for an element that's going to become pretty important for sustaining Chinese culture throughout the generations. All right, moving on to the historic symbol. And once more, thank you everyone for who wanted to get a little bit creative. I had some really good symbols that people sent in depicting the various dynasties, the Za, the Shang, or the Chao. And yeah, I mean, a lot of people sort of picked the bronze imagery, or the warfare, the chariots, the sort of the ruling ideology of the Shang. The Za was sort of captured more in mystery, some of the developments of agriculture and Chinese sort of kingship, and of course the Zhao with the kind of a reaffirmment of a lot of those, the mandate of heaven, and the oracle bones, and so forth. So I thought a lot of people did a very good job sort of taking those sort of key elements and turning them into images that sort of represented the broader idea and concept of the various Chinese dynasties. And it's interesting because you're going to see a lot of those same ideas, and you could probably use some of those same symbols for Chinese history moving forward from this time period, as a lot of them are going to be applying to the various dynasties that we're going to be encountering and talking about and viewing throughout the semester. Once more, another really cool way that people got creative was with their lesson plans, looking at the Indus River Valley civilization. A lot of times, the learning objectives were based around the things that we'd already talked about. The fact that there wasn't a kingship model, that there wasn't a lot of violence, the Harappan cities, how sort of well maintained and organized and orderly they were, as well as sort of some of the artifacts. Getting a knowledge for the stamp seals, knowledge of the language that they were using, even though it hasn't been translated yet, kind of maybe contemplating or guessing at some of the functions it might have filled. Um, and that this is oftentimes where a lot of the important terms came from, the city names that we've been talking about, and so forth. And yeah, then a lot of people got really, really cool ideas about the activities. A lot of them kind of based around group activities that a class could do. Someone brought up a really cool idea of making like a people making their own stamp seals, for example, and trying to replicate the stamp seals that we see in the Indus River Valley out of clay or Play-Doh or something like that. Someone else, had the idea of watching a movie about the Indus River Valley and then having kind of discussion groups based off upon that. But overall, a lot of very good ideas on how to sort of creatively present the information that was we have learned about this week. And really, that's kind of the main thing I'm looking for. If you take the information we learned about, use it in a creative way, pretty much everyone got full points here. All right, and sort of one more kind of fun topic that a lot of you seem to enjoy considering. Given the choice to live in one of the ancient civilizations we have studied so far, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus River Valley, or China, which would you choose and why? And it actually seemed like we had a really big split here between people. And it was really cool seeing everyone's explanations as far as why they would want to live in one location or the other. Some people kind of mentioned the idea of the natural abundance from the Nile River in Egypt, the benefits that gave the Egyptian people. The fact that pyramids are just really cool. I mean, who wouldn't want to live by pyramids, or even have the chance to potentially work and help build one of these monumental structures? Also, the idea of how important Ma'at was, and that living in a society that favored stability to that degree was something that was beneficial. Not a lot of people chose Mesopotamia. I think a lot of people got the idea that maybe Mesopotamia was a little bit more chaotic, not necessarily the brightest place to live, but some people said, hey, I mean, it'd be really different from today's society. It's one of the locations where a lot of sort of the first happened, the law codes, and the architecture and the science, so that they would kind of want to be on sort of the cutting edge of the development of civilization, so to speak. So I think it's some pretty good reasons there. China, sort of the same reasons, that it was such a large centralized state that bronze would have been really cool. They liked the idea of that, and a lot of people also chose the Indus River Valley. The fact that they seem to have not as much social stratification, there seemed to be more equality. There seemed to be more equality between the genders, so it seemed to be much more of a matrilineal society where women had a higher role within society. Also, the fact that they had running water would have been really cool. Like I said, that might inform my ultimate decision if I had to pick one of these. But yeah, I like the reasons that people gave for whichever they would want to live in, and I think you all gave some really sound reasons for why you chose the location that you did. So overall, very good answers this week. Keep up the hard work, and we'll go on to discuss our primary source. All right, taking a look at our primary source documents for this week. Um, yeah, really kind of looking at the archaeology and the physical artifacts being left behind by the Indus River Valley and Shang, China. And overall, I thought the class did a really good job of bringing out the kind of very important elements that these kind of different artistic forms and artifacts had for each of the civilizations. For example, just looking right away here at the Indus River Valley stamps, people were bringing up the connection with animals, how they focused on a lot of animals in their artwork, and you certainly see that in other locations as well. here in their various elements. A lot of people also noted the materials that were being used. The fact that the Indus River Valley was using quite a bit this kind of clay for their purposes. In a lot of their elements, some bronze mixed in, some probably some wood that was being used in there, but all of it would have been very abundant in the sort of Indus River Valley where they were located, whereas in China you see kind of more of this sort of jade being used, ivory, and obviously bronze, right? Bronze being very, very valuable to the Shang dynasty in particular, focused very heavily. So you can certainly see kind of the natural environments being depicted and represented in the various forms. People pointed out kind of the writing that seemed to be important in the stamp seals. Of course, we still don't know what this writing means. It has not been recorded or translated yet. And part of the problem, if you look in all these various examples here, is that in each case, there might be a number of symbols, maybe a couple words, but nothing that's long enough for us to actually try to use to get a full translation. And it's hard when you just have these sort of snippets, so to speak, of this. There's no like tablet with like an epic or story that's written down with a whole lot of characters that you could try to start working through. Most of them are contained in these kind of stamp seal little depictions here, which is one of the reasons why their language probably still has not been fully recorded yet. Other things that people noticed about the Harappan civilization, the depiction of women in a lot of their depictions here. That women obviously seem to have held a large and important role in Harappan society. That they seem to have a higher status within that society. That these could be representing religious figures who are important for religious functions. But because we don't really understand the writing, there's some early evidence, for example, of Shiva here, or gods that may eventually become kind of linked to those Hindu gods in very early forms. But we don't have a great idea or sense of the religious ideas of the Indus River Valley. But a lot of people did a good job pointing that out. Also pointing out that a lot of these scenes seem to just sort of be everyday life that you see with the Indus River Valley civilization. That they, besides some of those depictions that might have had more religious or symbolic elements, that a lot of it was just kind of the nature that was around them, their everyday life, pulling a cart, and then people point out that they seem to have kind of games, sort of whimsical little carvings and dice that they would have been using and so forth. So some pretty interesting observations on the part of the Indus River Valley artifacts. And there were a lot of those for the Shang too. The fact that a lot of this seemed to be really detailed, right? It seemed there was a lot of time and effort that was being put into the creation of these various artistic pieces. And a lot of these artistic pieces probably took longer than the evidence that we see here in the Indus River Valley civilization. So they were probably, people in that civilization that was able to take the time, and they had the materials necessary to sort of create these more detailed representations that you probably did not have in the Indus River Valley civilization, or there was just really no reason for them to go about putting this much time and effort into something like this when they, from their perspective, maybe seemed like they had better things to do. But the Shang certainly focused in. You could see the very high level of quality and workmanship present in these various artistic pieces. A lot of people also pointed out that it seemed like the Shang vessels had a more kind of utility purpose, that there was a ritual purpose behind them. For example, the Shang bronzes here, every kind of religious ceremonies focused around them, or perhaps scenes from their mythology, or perception of the spiritual world and so forth. So yeah, overall some very good representations and depictions here, and overall that's really what I was looking for with this, is that you're using specific examples from the documents to try to make these observations. And if you lost some points on this activity, that's typically wise, because you might have said something in general, but you didn't use an actual, for example, the Shang bronzes show that, or the carved depiction of a water buffalo is representative of, you need those kind of very specific evidence to back up the arguments that you're making in in these primary source discussions. So try to make sure you're continuing to do that. If you did not like the grade you received, let me know. We can talk about, where you might be falling a little bit short here and there. But overall, I thought people did a very good job of bringing out those specific examples to help make their cases. All right, thank you all very much. Have a great week, and I will be back for a review next week.